Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals, which investigates public health effects due to environmental contamination and offers preventive action. Okay, I just don't know where people are sitting. Well, you have slides?
No. I have, this is,
Well, do you want to go over there and speak? Or is this being recorded?
Yes.
Okay, so you have to go over there.
Okay.
That's the user question you have to ask for the moderator.
I can.
This way.
I did.
You know, our risk communication training, I mean, you never want anything in front of you, right? I don't know what to do now that I have a table in front of me. It's true, it's really a privilege to be here, although I've had a lot of difficulty developing an approach to this presentation because in the Office of Public Health, we are generally used to looking at the total population, and so after struggling with this for several weeks, really, because I couldn't decide if it was just being a Southern woman, I couldn't deal with women's issues, or being a public health official, that maybe I just was compelled to look at the public.
Just having fun.
I've thought about it a lot since then. But what I'm going to do is just give you, take the bureaucratic approach and give you kind of a background on our program with some, and hope that the women's issues will fall out, and I think they will. I've given you all a packet, and maybe we loosely call it a packet. Put the papers together, and I think that you can follow along. The Office of Public Health is part of the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals, and within the Office of Public Health is the section of environmental epidemiology. Now, I actually wrote a mission statement for the section of environmental epidemiology for this, which I'm not going to read, but I would like to read to you the last paragraph because it's important to me, and I'd like to state it precisely. As a public health program using an applied science approach, the section of environmental epidemiology primarily investigates group rather than individual health effects from long-term low-dose chemical exposures. It often supports, collaborates, and participates in scientific research related to environmental health. The program is firmly committed to immediately eliminating any known threat to the public's health. When such definitive scientific information is unavailable or equivocal, the section of environmental epidemiology considers it important to provide as much information and data as possible to the public in order to facilitate better governmental policies, legislative actions, and personal choices within Louisiana. Public health education efforts by SEE are relatively inexpensive, and then it goes on to say we do a lot of health education. But what I guess what I really wanted to stress is that we're an applied science approach. And that means that we don't have the luxury or the challenge of working within a lab and controlling any variables at all. And our mission more, I feel, is to serve the public, to attempt to answer all of their concerns, or at least give them information if we can't give them definitive answers. We don't do research ourselves, although I think some of our projects are research-oriented. For instance, I'm going to ask Linda Calvert, who coordinates our geographic information system, to show you what we're developing in that area. And I think liberally you can call that research. But I think more importantly than anything, rather than hold back information, we feel that we should give information. Any information that is not, obviously we shouldn't protect the confidentiality of any patients regarding their health status. But this will allow government and legislature and individuals to come to their own choices about how this society and how Louisiana plans to handle environmental contamination. We receive our funding from federal agencies and from the state. We have a team of usually toxicologists, epidemiologists, and environmental scientists, in addition to risk communicators, health educators, and within the Office of Public Health, we have sanitarians, physicians, I said, engineers, nurses, laboratory workers, and surveillance personnel. It's a true team, and I believe that it is compelled to be a team because each problem presented to us focuses on a different issue. Sometimes you need a toxicologist to lead your plan or your approach. Other times you would use an epidemiologist and or an environmental scientist. And if it weren't a team approach, I'm sure that we would have one of those disciplines as head of our program. In addition to that, our investigations include concerned citizens, media representatives. I feel that the media is very fair in the state. I don't think it's the obligation of the media to present only the side or opinion of the Office of Public Health. I think that they attempt, for the most part, to give a balanced view, and I only wish that they would call us more often, particularly certain ones. We also work with other government officials, we work with physicians, and we work with attorneys. It is not our opinion that if a client is in litigation over environmental contamination, that excludes them from any services that our office has to offer. In fact, sometimes we take information from attorneys that they've collected for cases that they feel our office does not have, and we consider it in our investigations. Our program started in the 1980s, and it lasted for about 5 years, and then it took a dive, and we got down to a half a person working on her doctorate in 1988. At that time, they hired 2 of us, and I would say in the last 5 years, we have brought the program up to a staff of 14 with a budget that went from about 100,000 federal and state to almost $1 million annually. It's still only 14 people that cover the state of Louisiana and all the environmental problems that we have. We feel that the Office of Public Health in environmental investigations is primarily responsible to protect the public's health. I mean, you have DEQ and the Department of Agriculture that also include health in their mandate, but I think that when it comes to those type of investigations, they rely very heavily on our expertise. One of the things that we do is public health assessments on Superfund sites, and Superfund sites, as some of you know, are hazardous waste sites that have been listed by EPA for remediation. We have 12 in Louisiana, soon to have, I believe, 14. And with that, we attempt to write a report using existing data from either EPA or DEQ to address current or future exposures. One of the problems that we have over and over again is that we don't have data, environmental data about past, that we can even make estimations about past exposure. For instance, one of the sites in Slidell is Bayou Monfuca, and out of our investigation, or at least in our investigation along with the Department of Environmental Quality, an advisory was issued on the bayou itself. And most of our sites are in South Louisiana. I don't know why that is. I was thinking of why is that driving up here? Because it's from all sources except petrochemical. I mean, so you would think it would be distributed a little bit differently. We also do toxic substance investigations. For instance, we actually identified a woman that was living in a log cabin that was being poisoned because when you move into a log cabin, you treat the logs, and it was a misapplication of that treatment. And I mean, it's a nice success story, and those are real difficult to do. We also have a pesticide surveillance program, which we do in cooperation with the Department of Agriculture. Actually, they pay us and to do these investigations, and when individuals feel that they have been exposed to pesticides, the Department of Agriculture goes out, they take a report, they send it to us, we evaluate that. We don't do any physical examination. We will try to get any kind of physician's records, but if they're unavailable, we will talk about the type of exposure we have. If we know the levels, we'll give estimates as to what kind of effects you could have. We have a voluntary pesticide hypersensitivity registry. If a patient of a physician feels that he or she is hypersensitive to pesticides, and that physician agrees and signs a form saying that, we will put them on a registry and ask the aerial applicators in that area, notify them of that person, and ask them not to spray when that person is home, or to notify them when they're going to spray. I think something of real interest to you that I'll talk about at the end is that we have done a summary report of our investigations for the years 1991 and 1992. So we have information about the types of exposures that we have gotten reports on, and I'll give you some of that. I'll give you the conclusion actually at the end. We also do some indoor air investigations. And for instance, in Baton Rouge, we did one at Alexis Clark School, which is over a landfill, and we work closely with DEQ on that, and feel that that is also something that we really need to work on in the future, is identify landfills throughout the state and look at which ones are either heavily populated or have schools over them, which is something that happens very often because the land is cheap, and so it gets donated, or the school boards buy it and put schools over them. We do disease cluster investigations, but I will tell you that in truth, the section of environmental epidemiology is really a screening program, in that if we would find that there was truly something that we would consider to be a possible cluster, we would have to find funding and refer it to another agency to do that investigation. These are very time-consuming, expensive investigations. For instance, you may not realize it, but the St. Gabriel study that we did a few years ago was actually a disease cluster investigation, where women in Iberville Parish felt that they were being exposed to toxic chemicals and were having an unusual amount of miscarriages as a result of that. And so with federal and state funding, we contracted with Tulane School of Public Health to do an investigation, and their conclusion was that there was not a cluster in that area. On the other hand, in St. Mary Parish, we contracted, in fact, Dr. Vivian Chen is here today, with LSU Medical Center to do an investigation of a neuroblastoma cluster that we had identified, to find out if it was environmentally related. And at that time, the conclusion was that it was not. But since that, we have followed up with a petitioned health assessment to ATSDR to assess the effects of marine shell processors, which the citizens associated with the neuroblastoma cluster. That is still being reviewed. What I was going to say and started to say is the problem with disease cluster investigations, as I'm sure some of you know, is that if we have a hazardous waste site, the population that we feel is probably exposed to any chemicals off-site is too small to make any significant epidemiological conclusions. If you go far enough away to get a significant population, then you've lost your exposure. There are complex interactions between genetics, lifestyle, and actual exposures, and so you can see that we have a challenge. We, since we began the program, have developed, and it's in your packet, advisories throughout the state that were existing. If you can believe it, there was no systematic review of any advisories in this state. Agencies must presentation. So what we have now is we've gotten all the chemical, this is just chemical, not infectious or bacterial, contaminant advisories that result from chemical contamination in a table, and we have developed a protocol which is being reviewed now by the Department of Agriculture, Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, where we can take a systematic approach to identifying contamination in the food chain and issuing advisories, or in fact, we're sending advisories. We also developed a brochure on how to cook contaminated fish, which I know is offensive to many, but in fact, it's a reality in some areas. And so we're attempting to adjust for those realities. We would like to know what type of things are referred to our office, where we can expand, where the needs are. With Tulane, we've developed a database for tracking all of our calls and contacts. Unfortunately, as you know, in developing databases and implementing computer systems, we need another chip of some kind or something like that. But I hope within the next year, we'll be able to track all our referrals so we can identify the needs of the state. We also disseminate information. For instance, one of the advisories addresses mercury contamination, which is a real concern in the state, in fish. And we sent out a pamphlet to physicians in, well, actually it was 400 physicians in 4 to 6 parishes on mercury, and also how to take an exposure history. And we have had some positive feedback from the physicians and feel that we've helped them in some of their diagnosis. In the Calcasieu Estuary, which has an advisory existing as a follow-up to a health assessment that Tulane did for us on that estuary, we have gone in and done a childhood school education program for 5th to 7th graders on the advisory itself and telling them what is contaminated, where is it is contaminated, what contamination means. I think a lot of citizens can benefit from that, and we hope that the children will also educate their parents. And we have received major federal funding to develop a geographic information computer tracking system, and I'm going to ask Linda to give a little explanation of that and the projects involved in
I think
that.
I need to sit here, right? So I'll just
Yeah.
sort of point up to the wall. Okay, in December of 1990, DEQ and DHH were given an equal amount of congressional appropriation. We each got $900,000 to study environmental health effects in Louisiana. And the money came through the section of environmental epidemiology within DHH. And the first thing that was done was a database inventory, because we decided we were going to use a geographic information system and we needed to know what data was out there to use. A database inventory of Office of Public Health was completed, as was one of DEQ. What eventually we'll have at the end of this year, October of 1994, will be statewide mapping of 4 health outcomes. We'll have cancer, mortality, stillbirth, low birth weight, and congenital anomaly. And then we will also have cancer incidence map from 83 to 87 for southern Louisiana. That's available. So what we decided to do was, you can see the left side of this poster is Ascension Parish, and we did a pilot project in Ascension Parish. We're completing that now to test the surveillance of a health outcome and environmental indicator. And what we chose to use was low birth weight for 1985 to 1992. Because unlike cancer, there's a short latency period with birth, and we were going to connect that with drinking water data, because we felt that if we knew that people were drinking the water, then it would be direct exposure. We ended up having some trouble with that because in Ascension Parish there's 130 public water systems, over 500 private wells, and we mapped all those. We do have it mapped. It's not on this particular poster presentation, but it became impossible to find out who was drinking what water. But what we are doing is we're going ahead, mapping the low birth weight. We're showing, the reason we chose Ascension Parish is because DEQ had already completed parish of 11 environmental parameters. There's 3 Superfund sites there. There's a number of other hazardous waste sites. There's injection wells. It's right on the industrial corridor. So it was a good parish to use. When you can go up later and look at the poster. The bottom one shows the environmental parameters, and it also shows the 3 Superfund sites. And we put a 2-mile radius around each one. And on there, the private wells are shown inside the radii. And we're looking at, okay, with, okay, the top, let's see, the top left map, or I guess the middle left map is census tiger files, and that gives you the roadworks and the different boundaries used by the census. And there's tracts, there's block groups, and there's blocks. A tract is about 4,000 people, a block group is about 650 people, and a block is down to somewhere between 80 and 100 people. And we're mapping the low birth weight at the block group. But then around the Superfund sites, we're going to the block level to get some more detailed information. And on here you can see we have a chart where we pulled out demographics around the 3 sites at the block level. So we took the blocks, then took the circle and figured out which blocks fell within the circles around each site and saw what the demographic makeup was. And they don't give income down at that level, but they do give some housing information. So we figured by what the rental prices were that we get with some indication of economics and socioeconomic status. So you can look at that later. One thing that showed up interestingly was that 2 of the sites were pretty much the same racial and economic makeup as the rest of the parish, whereas one of the sites was predominantly African American. The other thing over here is a lead study, and that was done because we knew that we had a human biomarker we could use. What you will see here are soil lead, and it's at the tract level in Orleans Parish. The middle map there is the soil map, the lead levels. And then the bottom 2, what we did is correlate demographic data with that to see which variants were most likely related to the high soil lead. And what that came out to be was housing, areas of housing built before 1940, and also areas of a lot of vacant housing, and that's all by census tract also. And then we will be adding the blood lead to that to see how that correlates. And eventually we'll be able to predict risk by saying, well, we know that these variables indicate high lead in soil, which is probably an area we might want to go into and see if that's a high blood lead level area also. And lastly, one thing that we will be completing with this project is we're contracting with LSU with a lot of the GIS work, and they're helping us to develop a query system, and it's going to be a menu-driven system for the Superfund sites in the state, and it will give demographics at the block level. It will give 5 health outcomes I discussed before, and hopefully we'll have private wells mapped around each of those sites also. So that can be easily pulled out for all the Superfund sites. Thank you. Did I cover everything?
Yeah, thanks. And that query system will allow people that, it's very difficult to learn GIS, years of training. And so you won't have to know GIS to get into our GIS database. Let me please caution that this system will offer correlations, and we look at it as hypothesis generating, whereas if you get variables that are associated, then you would definitely have to go in and follow up with more definitive studies. We feel that we can look at issues of environmental justice as well as health issues. We can identify populations at risk, perhaps the undernourished, or the elderly, or the very young. And DEQ has used their funding out of this project to do a lot of sampling, and one of their projects I think that would be of interest to you in Baton Rouge is they funded these ozone studies that I think the people that live in Baton Rouge follow very closely. We have a lot of community participation. In our program, we have developed community assistance panels for all of our Superfund sites in Louisiana. In addition to that, we have a statewide health assistance panel for our GIS, which is composed of around 25 scientists and like 11 universities throughout the state. And I think this D'Souza is a member. I was trying to identify someone. Yes, Lauren. Lauren is a member. And we also, out of our health assistance panel, have developed a subcommittee to investigate how GIS can evaluate environmental justice issues. We also, in our Ascension Parish study, have a CAP, our Community Assistance Panel, to inform them as we go. You know, if you pick one parish in the state, they're usually, you can assume, will be terrified. Why did you pick us? So we want them to know they shouldn't be terrified. We do a lot of interagency work. We work with the federal government. We work with lots of state agencies. Out of the Louisiana Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights, one of the mandates to the Office of Public Health was Louisiana health officials should develop a database and risk assessment methodology to answer questions about the distribution of pollution and exposure to health on the basis of race, ethnicity, and income. And we feel that our GIS is attempting to do that. I have a little editorial, my own opinion, that in terms of the St. Gabriel study, I know that there were many, or a few residents and state citizens that were not happy with the results. And I think that although we're very proud of the study, I think it is very important to listen to the community and answer their questions. And sometimes you may, scientists may decide what the best question is, but they might miss the question that the community is asking. And so it's very important to listen. I would also say another problem is that you must act in a timely fashion and you must follow through. And I think Florence Robinson's here to attest that with the petrol processor site, the health department did not do that. This site has been around since 1960, and when we went in to do our health assessment, the community, well, in general, citizens don't trust government, but this particular community really doesn't trust government. And although I know that we have made considerable efforts, I doubt if we'll ever be able to be at a point that I would be happy at in that community. I think that the value of our program is that we prevent acute and chronic exposures and we protect the environment. I would like for us all to also to contribute to an environmental health knowledge base, which I think GIS might take us to. This year, we are asking for 2 new and expanded programs, which Dr. Barlow has supported through the Louisiana Medical Society, I believe. One is an indoor air program, which we feel the state desperately needs. We would like to start off evaluating indoor air in schools, and that little program will cost about $300,000. And if there's any opportunity you have to support us in that, we would appreciate it. We also feel of equal or greater importance, we need a fish advisory, well, we call it a fish seafood contamination control program, but basically it's to actually have a program to look at fish contamination and develop advisories. And right now, we don't do any sampling in the health department. We just get data that is accumulated through either DEQ or agriculture. And that program would probably start off at $500,000 and go down, but we feel it's well worth it. The chief complaints that we get when people call about environmental illnesses related to the environment are, of course, cancer, poor pregnancy outcomes, respiratory problems, and neurological problems. As you know, and as you hear all the time, Dahl and Pito, and actually the EPA in separate exercises, estimated the cancer mortality in the U.S., well, I think they say 2 to 4%, and that comes to about 9,000 to 3,000 deaths annually. That's mortality. Some cancers, however, in the world, such as melanoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, seem to be increasing. And I think that there's, in terms of the estimation of cancer causality and environmental contribution, I think that we will always be getting new information, and that would be defined a little bit better. We do want to tell you that in terms of Louisiana and in terms of the tumor registry, we have a tumor registry, and we feel the quality, the data is in South Louisiana is of certainly acceptable quality, and from that, some of the things that we have learned is that, and I'm going to give you statistics that relate to men and women. African American males and females experience stomach cancer rates above the national average in Louisiana. African American women have elevated cervical cancer incidence rates. Caucasian males and females have higher kidney cancer and non-Hodgkin lymphoma incidence rates. And Caucasian females have higher brain and other central nervous system incidence rates. Of course, I mean, this is not to alarm you, this is just to address some of the questions that I think you would like to advance here or gotten information on. Now, I'd like to read you the conclusion of our pesticide report for 91, 92, and these are just related to incidents that were referred to us through agriculture. And so these were people that called in and reported this. This certainly is not all the people that were exposed in Louisiana during 91 and 92. In the last 2 years, there are 167 reported pesticide-related incident cases in the state of Louisiana. Of the 167, 55.5 were female. Most cases are younger than 40 years old. In fact, 36% were younger than 20 years old. Headache and skin and eye irritation were the most frequent symptoms reported. There are seasonal trends. May, July, August, and September are the months during which most incidents occur. Organophosphates, such as azofosmethyl, are the pesticides reported most frequently as being involved with exposures. There's a yearly increase in exposure, but this was, it was noted that that could be from the use of the surveillance system, and we couldn't make any conclusions about that. But I do want to note that this is supported by the Department of Agriculture, and that they are interested in targeting any misapplications so that they can do a better job. In terms of health assessments, one of the conclusions from ATSDR is that metals and volatile organic compounds were the most commonly detected contaminants around their Superfund sites. And they said that their data, when evaluating in aggregate, seems associated with a small to moderate increase in some kinds of birth defects and less well documented in some specific cancers. I also want to point out that, so I've given you the two programs that we'd like to stress indoor air and developing the seafood contamination. We are also working with the Stanley Scott Center, Southern University, and DEQ to develop a major study along the Mississippi River from Baton Rouge to New Orleans to study cancer and environmental contamination. What I feel in the future that we haven't written that I would like to write programs for is that the health department would like to do health assessments or exposure assessments around all of the hazardous waste sites in Louisiana to determine human exposure. And we would like to, as I told you earlier, identify landfills and see what schools and populations living over those landfills and look at exposure also. The data gaps, what we have learned from GIS and from just working in this state, is that actual exposure is not there. Very rarely, what you may have, if you're lucky, is environmental data and human health outcomes. And what we really, I think we can improve our public health efforts and scientific efforts, health in general, by having actual exposure data, looking toward biomarkers, you know, blood, urine, hair, fingernails, fat. Registries are lacking. We don't have reproductive registries. We don't have, one of the recommendations that came out of the St. Gabriel study was that we should develop a model or standard protocol for miscarriage investigations. That means a national model, so that results of studies in different populations can be compared. The protocol should include a standard questionnaire and on, but you can understand what they need is to aggregate group data. Standard decision guidelines should be developed for assessing the results of these studies. We need registries on respiratory illness. We need access to hospital records so that we can get that. And it would be very nice if this state routinely tested private well water, which they don't now. The chemicals that we probably will be focusing on in the next year will be carbon monoxide. I think that you all have all read in the paper where over this winter season we've had 3 deaths related to that. Of course, heavy metals such as lead and mercury and cadmium. Of course, pesticides, and there is some interest in when they burn the sugarcane fields and nitrates. Of course, smoking, secondary smoke, asbestos, formaldehyde, and radon. VOCs, as they're presented in gasoline, either as spills, getting into the groundwater, our drinking water, or automobile exhaust, and chlorine as it relates to its use in industry and drinking water. And that's it. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Yes.
I have 2 questions. How are you defining congenital anomaly in study populations?
Well, what we do is we will take, from the birth file, we'll take all of the congenital anomalies listed.
In other words, whatever the report, the physician prescribes and record it down in the
How severe a malformation are, and I mean, you got everything from birthmarks to whatever, and how minimal does the deformity have to be?
Do you mind? Well,
Not at all.
it varies tremendously, and it depending on the pediatrician who examined and decided what to put down. I think there was at one time when the vital statistics people were reviewing their data, and they observed an increase in a real and normal increase in rate of reporting there. And they looked into, they actually pull up the birth certificates and review some of those. Apparently they have a new pediatrician that coming to that parish, and he's reporting everything, like his finger, little toes, and he report all those. So if you report them as an abnormalities, and so when you just look at overall abnormalities, it just goes.
Could you give her the microphone?
Dr. Chen is an epidemiologist and a consultant on our program, if you don't already know.
Well, the reason why I'm asking that question is because I'm a radiologist at Women's Hospital, and I reviewed several years of birth data looking at, trying to evaluate our ability to identify prenatally anomalies by ultrasound. And I had a big problem in terms of trying to find out where to legitimately draw the line as to what's an anomaly and what's not. And I was wondering how y'all were doing that so that you can have a consistent database over a wide population.
No, I'm not working with the vital statistics. Just
Right.
use their data, and when that problem arose, the question asked is that they have some kind of protocol, but the main determinant of what is going over there is what the pediatricians or whoever who put down the information in the birth certificate. And it's pretty much depending from physician to physician. And when they were coding those information, a lot of times they may code some of those very specifically, and it doesn't fit in any other one of those codes. They will go into a big category, say others, and it will still go into the category, say yes and no. Okay, so if you just look at statistics to show there is any abnormalities, then you the data is just varies tremendously.
Is that both questions?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
I know you.
It's going to be real hard to evaluate
Yeah.
those results unless you look at specific knowledge.
Well, you see, that's the thing, and even like with GIS, whenever you would get a correlation, it's just a first pass. I mean, it's such a broad brush, you just really have to go in and look and see what that means out to.
And how are you distinguishing between a stillbirth and miscarriage? At what gestational age?
I don't know. I don't think that, right. I don't think we're doing, I don't know. But I could find out for you.
Thank you. You certainly have outlined some of the things you're trying to do, and then when you try to do them, the problems that you get into, just setting them up, it is difficult. You see something, and that's observational, and then you try to get enough data to see if you can find trends, and then you think you know what they are, you study them, and then that's not quite right, you keep adjusting, but that's where a lot of the excitement of your findings will be. We're going to move on now. Dr. William Fontenot received his BA in political science in 1969 from the University of Southwest Louisiana. For the past 15 years, he has worked as an environmental specialist for the Louisiana Attorney General's office. In this capacity, he has helped to organize more than 300 citizens groups in Louisiana and 30 other states. These groups have worked to solve a wide variety of environmental problems. He has also worked extensively with the news media in the development of environmental stories. Prior to joining the Louisiana Department of Justice, he worked as executive director of the Louisiana Wildlife Federation. He has also served as chairman of the New Orleans group of the Sierra Club, as well as on boards of numerous other citizens groups.
Let me suggest Dr. Callender just arrived, and I think he needs to get back to. You sure? It's okay. Let me get over there. You fine with returning?
Just a couple of minor things. I'm not a doctor. I have a degree in political science and just a BA at that. But I have been working on environmental issues in Louisiana and a number of other states for about 25 years, and have had the pleasure in the last couple of years of working with Dr. Ken Olden and other folks at the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences on trying to figure out how to, let me do this maybe. I'm going to be showing some slides. How to improve the ability of federal health and environmental agencies to identify problems that the public is concerned with, and how to, what can I do? Like this? Okay. Can you hear me all right? How to get the agencies to work closely with citizens. Last week we had a conference in Washington, D.C. on environmental health, and it was sponsored by a number of federal agencies, including Health and the Environmental Protection Agency. Dion Dugas and other folks who are here today were at that conference. And basically the federal health agencies feel that in a large measure they're not being responsive to the environmental health concerns and needs of the public. What I'd like to do is give you a view of some of the environmental problems in Louisiana and some of the complexities, because even the presentation up here on this board, though I think it's very important to start categorizing where things are and where people live, particularly in something like Ascension Parish, there are 3 Superfund sites, but there are dozens of other sites where industrial waste were dumped. There's also 2 major industrial complexes in that parish, and if you mark 2 miles from the Inger Oil site, you would include, I don't know, maybe 12 or 15 major petrochemical facilities, some of the largest facilities in the state of Louisiana. At the Dutchtown site, if you go 2 miles from it, people 2 miles from the Dutchtown site are less than a mile from this same major petrochemical facility. And they're exposed to, and have through the years been exposed to things like vinyl chloride monomer and others which were not necessarily dumped at either one of the Superfund sites. The Superfund sites in Ascension Parish, 2 of them were small oil and hazardous waste recycling facilities, and the exposure to people 2 miles away would have been very limited, except in the case of Inger Oil, which burned. The last time was when Chevy Chase was down here filming the movie Fletch Lives. And it was about people dumping hazardous waste in the back 40, this old plantation site. And they had to evacuate the plantation site, which was in the movie, while the filming was going on. So there's also, in 1973, the FDA, testing cattle in a slaughterhouse in Gonzales, Louisiana, which is in Ascension Parish, found hexachlorobenzene at, I believe, 1.5 parts per million in a steer, which came from Darrow, a herd at Darrow, which is next to the Inger Oil site. And it was identified as waste which was being hauled to a couple of dump sites, one of which is on the Superfund site, the Cleve River site. In 1974, EPA commissioned the University of New Orleans to do a study looking for the presence of hexachlorobenzene along the Mississippi River. And in 73, the FDA quarantined all of the cattle in East Ascension Parish because of that 1.5 part per billion hexachlorobenzene. It was identified as coming from a couple of facilities that produced dry cleaning fluids, perchloroethylene. But in 74, the study by UNO, that was the Center for Bioorganic Studies, found that there was extensive amounts of hexachlorobenzene that had been dumped on all of the roadside ditches and railroad crossings and places where trucks stopped that were hauling this hex waste from Vulcan Chemical and I think one other facility to the Cleve River site and the BFI Darrow site. And their studies showed that there were excessively high levels in roadside ditches, places where people have been crawfishing for years. There's never been a follow-up study to that that I'm aware of. Now here were people hauling what are now considered extremely hazardous waste in open dump trucks that were lined with visqueen. The waste leaked out. I guess the length of driving was about 10 miles. So the entire 10 miles, depending on which way you went, large quantities of waste leaked out. So I think it's not enough just to document where those 3 Superfund sites are and the exposure to people that live within 2 miles of them, because in the case of the Cleve River site, waste was spilled along the roadway, whatever route they took, because they could have taken a couple of different routes. ATSDR, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, was part of the Federal Health Agency, has provided money to the Louisiana Department of Health to look at health risk and health exposure around Superfund sites. But they have not extended that money to look at other routes of exposure, like from petrochemical facilities, which may be right next to these Superfund sites. So I think my suggestion, and I guess a question, is whether or not the current approach to looking at human health exposure around Superfund sites or any other kind of site is adequate to really deal with the complexity of exposures. My guess is that it's not, and maybe we need to go back to square one and take another look at that. If I could maybe go through these slides, might help a little bit. Can everyone see this okay in the back of the room? Let me see some hands. Is it all right? let me hear from somebody on the back row. Can you see this okay? I can't see you, so you'll have to say something. Okay, it's okay? All right. Louisiana is a major producer of oil and gas. Since 1901, there have been about 120,000 oil wells drilled and gas wells drilled in this state. And I want to show you this because it gives you a sense of the complexity of exposures. This is a drilling rig in South Louisiana, and you'll notice there's a bunch of material on the bottom of the slide. And these are some of the materials that are used in drilling and production. Now, if you're a worker at this site, do you really have adequate information about what's in these different bags of materials that you may be handling? The clothes you wear at this drilling site are the clothes that you take home. Most of the people that have worked in the oil industry are male, but they take the clothes home. The kids jump on them in. The wives wash the clothes. They wash them, or they have to throw them away because they're too messy. And they track stuff home in their boots, just from the materials that are used. Oil which comes out of the ground, the petroleum, is a known human carcinogen because it contains benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and a lot of other stuff. This is a production site in North Louisiana. This is what it looks like today. And the pit next to it is full of oil. They're pumping out salt water, and then they pump the water into a pit, and the oil that is in it will rise to the surface. This is one of the largest sources of benzene and hydrocarbons in the state of Louisiana, and it has been that way for many, many decades, are open pits and tanks. None of this is included in the toxic release inventory, which industries have to report what they release into the environment. At this particular site, you have water on top of oil because there's some paraffins and other things in this, or the rainfall has fallen on it. Birds and other wildlife, birds in particular, I understand, are unable to discriminate between oil and water, and it's one of the reasons they become contaminated and foul in these waterways. And there have been a lot of reports, I've seen some from New Mexico and West Texas, where waterfowl die from getting into this, and then other wildlife come out and eat them because they're very handy, and they die. And so you start a whole chain reaction of potential exposure that way. This is an oil service company that went bankrupt and left all their waste next to Louisiana State University at Eunice, Louisiana, about a quarter of a mile from it, and there was a home next to it. This site was identified as an extremely hazardous site, and kids had been playing on it for years. No warning signs, nothing. This is a site where routinely, it's just sort of an example, you see the black material? Well, this is all water in this photograph. This is after heavy rain, and this is a major oil company that the field operators went out, put a pump around this ring levee, around the tank battery to the right, and pumped the waste out into the surface waters, which then ran off into the coastal waters in Louisiana. If there's any oil or other materials around that tank battery, it's getting right into the surface waters. This is an unpermitted discharge, and it's clearly an intentional discharge. You may not see this very well, but this is a drilling rig where they're burning off materials and the smoke is coming up. This is looking almost straight down at a drilling site. A lot of materials have been burned off at these sites, and I don't know what sort of hazards it presents, but it certainly adds a lot of air pollution. This is a very typical looking waste pit at a drilling site in North Louisiana. Could be anywhere where you have barrels and a lot of oily material. There's nothing to prevent this from getting into groundwater and surface waters. And even though it's supposed to be cleaned up, a lot of them are still out there. Here's a waste pit where the salt water, which is poured out for years, the pit is on the right. You can see the kind of black material. The salt water has eroded all of the dirt away from the site, and that salt water and whatever oil has gotten out of there has flowed off into surface streams and clogged the streams. This is a disposal from a production site where trenching was done. They dug a hole and then dumped the oily drilling fluids and stuff in this hole. Now, this is right on a rural road in Vermilion Parish, and this was about the 10th or 15th trench that had been dug at this particular site. And someday these are probably going to be home sites. Now, if you check the records to find out whether or not there was any waste ever put on this site, it won't show it because this was an unpermitted burial The drilling rig that this waste came from was about a mile from this particular site. And there are lots of sites in Louisiana where industrial waste, particularly from oil and gas operations, were buried like this. You could go in, put your house, this is in an area where people have private water wells because they're not near a community, and you could drill your well through this. Or you could put your garden on top of it or your house. Roots of exposure are pretty high. This is a site in North Louisiana where a waste pit was reported to be properly cleaned up, and this is the oil that is seeped back up to the surface from that properly cleaned up pit. This is a pit on the intercoastal waterway that was not properly cleaned up and was never reported. It's currently being investigated for inclusion on Superfund, but it's not on the Superfund list. And it was a tank cleaning. This is an interesting photograph. This is looking at Narco, Louisiana. At the top of the screen is the Mississippi River and the Shell refinery at Narco, and the complex across at Taft, which is across the river. And this is an oil and gas production field. This is the Good Hope oil field. And the white lines and little white boxes, those are Shell-lined roads. Each one of those little squares is a drilling site, and in the middle is a large waste storage area for this oil and gas facility. It's certainly bigger than the building that we're in. It's a very large area, and all of the wetlands around it have been damaged by salt water leaking out. Next couple of slides are just some oil operations in coastal wetlands where all the vegetation has been damaged and material has gotten out, and people fish and hunt in these areas. This is a commercial waste disposal facility near Morgan City that was built on an island. And you see the barges pull up to it, and the sludges are pumped out into open pits. This waste can get out. In a hurricane, this site would be underwater. And this is in Baton Rouge. This is a drilling rig next to a hotel. If there is an accident or problem with this drilling site, people in the budget motel are going to get probably some additional excitement. This is a home near Kaplan, Louisiana, where a drilling rig was placed. You can see this is the swing in the lady's backyard, fairly close to her house, I would say. The levee was about 3 feet from her bedroom window. If you had a drilling rig this close to you, if there's any sort of releases of materials, it's getting into your house. This sort of exposure has never been dealt with. Here's a waste pit near Abbeville, Louisiana, in South Louisiana, where there's a trailer park next to a truck washing pit, and the waste, which is identified as a hazardous waste, was leaking out into the backyard, and this is an area where kids like to play along that fence. This is a gentleman working at a commercial disposal site where trucks bringing in waste. He hooks them up and he unhooks them, and he's got a lot of exposure there, but he has no idea what he's dealing with, and this has gone on for years. Now, there's a lot of material that leaks out from pipelines and leaks out naturally. In Louisiana, the first well drilled in Louisiana was a gas well, and it was a little seep like this. They saw natural gas bubbling up, heard about the excitement in Pennsylvania, and put a well in. But you see the bubbling there is just natural gas coming up out of the water. I don't know if it's from a leaking well or a leaking pipeline, or maybe just a natural seep. But this is one that was near Abbeville in Vermilion Parish. There are thousands of leaks and whatnot every year. And I don't know how many blowouts have occurred in the state of Louisiana, but it's been quite a few. This is a leaking gas well where the gas was leaking out about several thousand feet below the surface. And this is a crop duster's landing strip. And he went out, and his son told him that he heard some noises out by the airstrip. Sounded like a sack of crawfish. When you have a sack of crawfish, and they move around in the sack and they go, well, that's what it sounded like. And he went out with his torch and lit it, and every place there was a crawfish hole, he got a flame. And this burned for 7 weeks. That's 1.5 miles from the city limits of Abbeville. And this is sort of what it looked like later at night. We counted more than 500 crawfish homes that had flames on them. Now that's over an area. This area was about a square mile where gas was leaking up out of the ground from this one well. Now the importance of that is because at this site, about a quarter of a mile from this site, a proposed solid waste landfill the guy was trying to get a permit and said that this was extremely impervious clays, that the clays in this part of Louisiana was so thick that it would stop the migration of waste into the groundwater. All right? Now this indicates to me that maybe his laboratory data doesn't match up to real life, what's going on out there, because this is gas coming up a few thousand feet and leaking up in a very large area. In fact, right next to the area where the landfill was proposed. This is a blowout in North Louisiana from a gas well. The gentleman here, his home is in the top of the screen, and the gas well was more than half a mile from his home, and it blew several very large holes in the ground on his property, and then several more large holes out in the field near his house. Now, the base of the fresh water at this particular point was about 700 feet below the surface. This is one of the holes where the gas is coming up out of the ground. The day we went out, the level of salt in this particular water was 13,000 parts per million, which is about 1/3 as saline as salt water. Anything above 500 parts per million, you start having trouble with vegetation, and people on a low salt diet would not do well with 500 parts per million of salt. But this is about 13,000 parts per million of salt. The oil company and the state agencies that went out and inspected this site said there was no problem with this, and the gentleman didn't have anything to worry about. And they were testing it every day, supposedly. Now, there have been billions of gallons, literally billions of gallons, I don't know how many billion, but lots of billions, of groundwater that have been contaminated in the state of Louisiana and other states with this kind of activity since the first well was drilled in 1901. And there's no record that I've been able to find anywhere, except going back to sort of anecdotally putting together of how much groundwater has been contaminated with salt water from drilling and production operations. And you have a lot of other contaminants that could easily get into the groundwater. This is a natural gas well. The well is actually the closest thing in the bottom right-hand corner. It's just a pipe coming out of the ground. And on top of that pipe are what are called flow meters. Now, from about 1916, flow meters were used to determine how much natural gas was flowing through the pipeline. And the primary flow meter that was used from 1916, and it was required by state law from 1925 on, until 1975, was called a mercury flow meter. Operates kind of like, best I can understand it. Somebody tried to explain it to me and it just, a little too complex. But it sort of works like a barometer. And this is a storage container. The person on the right is Audrey Evans, who's sitting over there from Tulane Environmental Law Clinic. But this is up on right off one of the wildlife refuges near Monroe. But this cylinder contains the mercury. It's about a liter of mercury. And this is what the ground looked like below. Well, this is on the wildlife refuge. There are now these signs warning that this area, the refuge, is contaminated with mercury, and to please watch out. This is the ground right below that flow meter you were just looking at, or the mercury storage vessel. And those little kind of silvery looking things on the ground is elemental mercury from the flow meter. Every time they do service on these meters, the people who work in the field tell me they always spilled a little bit. Sometimes they would drop the whole contents of that cylinder on the ground. Right now there are about 15,000 natural gas wells in Louisiana, every one of which has a mercury flow meter on it. Now a lot of them are being phased out and changed. Every natural gas company in the United States used mercury flow meters for their inflow. They use a little different meter on your home. Every corporation, major corporation that bought natural gas or used natural gas have mercury flow meters. And it's been dealt with in some states. This is a natural gas processing plant on Lake St. John, which is near Natchez. This is a small facility. If you drove by it, you wouldn't really think a lot of it. But according to folks who work there, a few years ago, this facility had more than 100 mercury flow meters in this facility alone. It now still has a number of them And they have 3 companies that buy gas from this facility, and they have their own mercury flow meters on this facility. There are also about 100 to 150 gas wells in this one gas field around Lake St. John, which is an oxbow lake of the Mississippi River. These are the kinds of things that people feel may be the source of the mercury contamination in Louisiana waterways. Besides the mercury from the flow meters and the naturally occurring oil and other things, in a lot of the produced waters, the waters which come up out of the ground with oil and gas, and it comes up at every well site, we have what are called naturally occurring radioactive material. It's basically radium, and it comes up in some very significant levels. This is a site south of Lafayette, Louisiana, where they were taking in salt water and oil from several wells and then injecting the salt water back underground. It's basically a blending plant. And they cleaned up, I think it was about 300 barrels of radioactive contaminated dirt from this one site. Wilma Suber, who's here, has some more accurate data on that. But some of the levels of radioactivity at this site were exceeded 2,000 or 3,000 picocuries per gram, which is pretty significant levels. And prior to about 2 years ago or 3 years ago when I took this, there was never any warning at any of these sites where these workers in the oil fields had worked that they might be exposed to radioactive material. It's a radioactive waste because it's not being used. It's on every pipe yard in the state of Louisiana, and probably a lot of other places. You can't see it, you can't smell it. We had a case in Lafayette, Louisiana with workers having radioactive material on the floorboard of their car, on the living room floor, where they brought the material home in their work clothes. No worker safety program, nothing. And people that rented out an apartment to one of the workers at the pipe yard, the worker would jump across the fence and come into the house. He dragged some of this radioactive material into their house. Tom Callahan might be able to talk about that a little more. This is a shot of the Mississippi River with shipping on it. And Louisiana has an extensive development of petrochemicals. This is an aluminum plant south of here with a petroleum coke facility next to it. This is part of the industrial complex here in Baton Rouge with the Mississippi River at the bottom of the screen. And there's, besides the big petrochemical plants, we have a lot of material that moves by rail. Louisiana industries lead the United States in the discharge of toxics into the environment. But not all of the material is counted. This is phosphate fertilizer production facility in St. James Parish, which is one of the largest discharges of toxics into surface waters and has been since they had to start reporting a few years ago. There are 2 facilities here. On the left is a little small kind of block facility. That is a uranium oxide production facility. There's enough radioactivity in the waste pile, or the waste material, that they are able to commercially harvest or retrieve marketable quantities of uranium oxide. This facility 3 years ago produced about 700,000 pounds of uranium oxide from processing the waste. Now you'll notice that the large kind of white area in that's the waste pile. It's larger than the industrial facility that is generating the waste. And we've got a few large piles like this in Louisiana. One thing that's not being dealt with is the groundwater contamination from these sites. The waste, which is piled up on these piles, and there are 4 plants, accounts for about 12.5 million tons of waste a year. They produce about 5 tons, according to their figures, produce about 5 tons of waste for each ton of product. The waste, when it's piled up, is listed as a special waste because, like the waste from the oil and gas industry, was exempted by Congress from their federal hazardous waste laws. So this waste that you see piled up there, even though EPA says it's unsafe to be used for any other material because of radioactive levels and possibility of production of radon if you build a house on top of it or something, is not considered or regulated as a toxic or hazardous waste. But any rainfall that comes in contact with that waste pile that is then discharged into surface waters is listed as a toxic waste. So contact rainfall is toxic, but the waste is not listed as toxic. You figure that one out. And there are a whole number of industrial discharges that go into the Mississippi. This is a little shot of a small plant north of Baton Rouge that discharges into the Mississippi River. And there are, at industrial sites, a lot of natural waterways were used as waste storage or sludge areas. This is a facility in Baton Rouge. What you're looking at there, that kind of colorful thing in the middle, is Bayou Hebert. It's not much. Bayou is an Indian word for river or stream. This is a Formosa Plastics facility, and there is no treatment from this pond for any of the water. It goes into a little stream called Montesano Bayou, and it's right next to the Mississippi River. So this is what is discharged in the Mississippi River. I don't know what the quality of this discharge looks like, but visually it's kind of an interesting shot. This is a major paper mill north of Baton Rouge. There are several mills in Louisiana that use the chlorine bleaching process. We have several waterways that have been identified as being contaminated with dioxin, such as Wham Break in North Louisiana. Wham Break for years, which has got some significant levels of dioxin in it apparently. Wham Break is part of, and has been part of, the Russell Sage Wildlife Management Area, where people hunt and fish. They now have signs warning that you shouldn't fish in Wham Break. This is the Georgia Pacific paper mill. This was taken a few years ago, but this is their, Blackwater is their, that's the Mississippi River, but that's their discharge into the Mississippi River. The dark muddy water is Thompson Creek flowing out into the Mississippi River. The clean stuff down in the little right-hand corner is the Mississippi River water. Let me see if I can get this. Well, it's not coming out. We have a lot of industrial discharges into the air. Most of it is not quite this visible. And so you're really not sure what's being released at any one time. If you happen to live next to a facility like this on this sort of day, which happened to be a major explosion at a plant and they had an upset, so they're burning off product there. You really don't know. For workers working in these plants, a lot of them have no idea what their exposures are. Now here's some workers working at a hazardous waste handling facility. And you'll notice the fellow on the right, his apron, he probably has worn more than an hour. The guy on the left has a very clean apron. He probably just put it on or put it on that day. A lot of these folks are using materials that are extremely hazardous that will penetrate gloves, aprons, the suits they're wearing. They're wearing kind of these little cloth or paper suits that are disposable, but a lot of materials can go through these rubber or whatever they are, protective gear. People get contaminated and have no idea what they're exposed to. Then they show up at Dr. Callender's office, and he has a heck of a time trying to figure out how to help them out. Industry has done a lot to clean up their act because they've had to. The laws and regulations and the problems, some of which I've illustrated here, have caused them to have to change the way they operated. This is Dow at Plaquemine, Louisiana. This is a hazardous waste transport truck hooked up to their incinerator. The kind of material that they incinerate at Dow now, they used to dump on a couple of dumps on the Mississippi River side of the protection levee and a little place near Florence's house called Petro Processes. And there's been a lot of effort by industry to sort of change public, what they feel is public perception that they haven't done a good job. Last year, the director of the Louisiana Chemical Association said they had done a public opinion poll, their fifth one in 5 consecutive years, and that this is Dan Bornay, who's the director of the Chemical Association, said that the public basically feels 5 things. 1, that the chemical industry has lied. 2, that they have contaminated the land, air, and water, and the people. And what they want the industry to do is to stop lying and clean up the contamination and start doing it right, or they're going to start opposing them getting permits. Now that's the Chemical Association's public opinion survey of residents of Louisiana. But that was Safe Energy Drive. This is the VCM monomer plant road. That's vinyl chloride monomer plant road. This is a little facility in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And that is a vinyl chloride, no, is that Scenic Highway? This is Scenic Highway in Baton Rouge with the industry along Scenic. Scenic Highway used to be apparently very scenic. And and this is part of effort. At many of the industrial sites in Louisiana, you will see this little sign which is working with the Department of Highways to clean up litter and trash along the highways. And I'm glad that the industries are doing this. But you can see this is sort of the industries have been built right up next to the River Road, which is a major tourist route in Louisiana. It's one of the most important tourist areas, and the tourists all have to travel next to these industries. And there were no consideration for putting buffers between the industries and the folks going to look at historical sites. And it's just sort of a land use consideration that was not included in the formula. This is the VCM plant in Lake Charles, vinyl chloride monomer, which is a known human carcinogen. And there are people living where I would be standing taking this photograph. There are a whole bunch of houses. Talked to several people just a few weeks ago. They had no idea really what's produced at the plant and what kind of health risks they might be exposed to. This is a vinyl chloride monomer plant south of Baton Rouge. This is the Georgia Gulf chemical plant. And a few years ago, they basically bought out the community next to them because of a concern of possible exposure, and the citizens had sued them. There are a number of places where the industries are buying out communities next to them. This is actually in Texas City, Texas, where you have a golf driving range next to an industrial facility. If there is a release from this, these guys will really probably not know what to do. Most of the people live in communities next to large industrial facilities, have no idea what to do if there is a release or accident. This is a church that used to be across the river here, and this is the church next to the oil refinery. It's right across the street from it. The little community was there. The oil company built the refinery there in '75, and just a couple of years ago bought out the community and moved everybody out. But there was never any consideration for what kind of exposure or problems might occur from an heavy industrial facility being located next to a community like that. Those sorts of things are being considered today. This is what's left of Taft, Louisiana, which is surrounded by a couple of major chemical facilities. And this is the lake next to the governor's mansion in the state capitol, which has a couple of permanent booms on it and a sign in English and Vietnamese that says no fishing, but it doesn't tell you that the fish are considered maybe less than desirable to eat because they have polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs in them above 5 parts per million. This is a warning sign in Devil Swamp Lake. It warns you that industrial waste have been dumped in here. There are two primary chemicals of concern, hexachlorobenzene and hexachlorobutadiene. This swamp is presently being evaluated by EPA to consider whether or not to put it on Superfund. A lot of dead trees are in this swamp. You can see the sign. It's the same sign at the bottom of the photograph. Unfortunately, the sign is basically unreadable because the Mississippi River during high water floods this entire area. In 1983, the level in the swamp was 10 feet higher than in this photograph. So it was basically about 5 feet above the sign. And the sign is covered with dirt from the high water. So even where there are good signs, sometimes they're very difficult to read and figure out what they say. This is over in Lake Charles on Bayou Dien, which is Bayou of the Indian, which is highly contaminated with hexachlorobenzene and hexachlorobutadiene, and has these little warning signs. Now, not everybody, if you didn't, Louisiana has a very high illiteracy rate. It also has people who do not speak or read English. So if you had that very complex sign, which had a lot of things on it, it's very informative, but if you don't speak or read English, it makes it kind of difficult. This sign is much better. It just has a little circle with a slash line through it that shows somebody swimming and fishing, which you may or may not understand means don't fish or swim here. But it doesn't tell you why. And it's an old sign. I don't think the phone number is still correct, but this is the response of some people to signs like that. It's a target of opportunity, or maybe they don't like the message. I don't know. Some of the warning signs don't look so threatening. I mean, this is a friendly looking, oh, come on in, toxic waste site. Look around. Some thought has to be given to those sorts of things. How do we communicate with people? Now, we have enough trouble communicating with the illiteracy of Louisiana. Well, at least this guy doesn't have a clue what those signs mean. And it's at the top of the food chain. Here's a little snake. It hasn't learned to read either. Here's some deer tracks on top of one of the Superfund sites in Louisiana with the warning sign at the top of the screen. Now, these deer obviously either don't care, they ignore these warnings or whatever. But the land right on the other side of that sign is leased or has been for years by a local hunting club. So any deer that walks in, this is toxic waste where this deer stomped for years. This is a petroprocessor site. It looks good here. This is a fairly recent shot. It's being cleaned up. This is the backside of the site. Now, the problem with doing, in my opinion, risk assessment of what kind of exposure people within 2 miles of the Superfund site might have at this site sort of exemplifies the difficulty here. The bottom of the site, there's sort of a black area or a dark area. That's the Superfund site. That's where waste was dumped. And the green area below that is the swamp. On the left side and in the middle is a secondary lead smelter. And they've been operating there since about 1955. And back in 1955, there were not a lot of restrictions on what you could pump out into the environment from a lead smelter. Next to it are 4 petroleum coke ovens. You can see kind of a plume of air pollution leaving the petroleum coke oven. People that live miles from this site have reported that they get a lot of black particulate matter, very fine particulate matter, on their homes, their patios, and their cars. Now, people are breathing this stuff miles away. So if you live 2 miles from this site, and there are a few other dump sites in this area, but if you live a couple miles from this site, the exposure is more than just that Superfund site. Now, another route of exposure for something like that, here's Bayou Baton Rouge, and is covered with a white material, which is from a recycler of this plastic material. They just happened to lose it one day, and they covered the swamp with this high-density polyethylene plastic. And this is Rollins, which is just downstream of the Superfund site. This is a commercial hazardous waste disposal site. The river is at the top of the screen. Highly contaminated area in the swamp is between Rollins and the river. But the highly contaminated area is primarily from petroprocessors. But we can't discount, this is Rollins' discharge pipe, which goes into the swamp. And they had a lot of problems through the years. Yeah. Okay, she wants me to wind up. Now, EPA wrote to the Food and Drug Administration last year saying that they just finished doing this survey in Double Swamp and that 500 pounds or more of crawfish were being harvested out of an area where they had found high levels of hexachlorobutadiene in Double Swamp. And it was being sold commercially in Baton Rouge or somewhere. I don't know. But 500 pounds a day is not an insignificant amount. And I'll stop right here because I want to do a couple of little pieces of things. But anyway, that'll give you an idea of some of the complexity of this. The paper I handed out shows some pesticide levels and an article about those pesticide levels. I got that information in 1977 from somebody that worked for one of the agencies that was doing a survey of 5 watersheds in the state of Louisiana. And they ripped off the first couple of pages because they didn't want the report being identified as having come from them. But it shows you that there are significant, or were, very significant levels of pesticides, primarily DDT and metabolites, and toxaphene in fish. A watershed is about the size of a county or parish. 2 parishes in Louisiana, or 2 areas where they look, the Bayou Bonnie Day and the East Franklin watershed, are located just to the east of Monroe, Louisiana. And these are fairly significant levels. Now, the article says that these are whole fish analysis, but the head of the feed and fertilizer lab at LSU that did the analysis, Ernie Epps, he was the director. He told me in 1979 that in fact these were fillet or edible portion only that they sampled. They never did any whole fish. So these are from the edible portion of the fish. Now, this report came out, this report never officially came out. When the article appeared in '78, I got calls from 4 agencies that said they were really concerned that this had gotten out because it was going to kill the study. And I really shouldn't have released it to the media. My concern was that people are eating these critters. Now, the only place in Louisiana where Commercial fishing is closed right now are on those water beds on coastal Louisiana because of bacteria related to oyster harvesting, and on, I think, the Tensall Wildlife Refuge, where they have gone back and done some more testing and found pesticides at what are considered alert levels. The Tensall Wildlife Refuge is not an area, it is to the east of the study area that these high levels of pesticides in fish indicate. Now, I don't know about you, but there's some catfish there that have 80 and more than 100 parts per million of the very materials that are talked about in the package that was given to us. There's a sheet that has little paragraphs about concerns about women's health, and one of them deals, I think, with organochlorines ending up in women's breast, and those are DETs and other materials. Now, if you're eating fish with these levels of pesticides in them, the organochlorines, what does that mean? I mean, normally we're talking about much, much lower levels. There have been no follow-up testing of these waterways, to my knowledge, or to even identify which waterways were tested since 1976. And I think it's very, very important to maybe consider, if this is primarily a cotton growing area, if these kind of levels are showing up in Louisiana, they were showing up in Arkansas and Mississippi and a few other states. But I'm not aware of any other data on pesticides and PCBs in fish in this part of the United States. And so I would throw out to you that our exposures and our health problems, maybe there's a lot more to environmental exposure than we've had really a chance to consider. Because if people are eating these levels of fish, Dr. Michael Kerr is here, and he's an avid fisherman, and I guess he's probably been out in some of these waterways that have these levels of fish. He's probably not real happy to sit here and look at this today, but gives you something to think about. Thank you.
I think we have time for a question. Is there someone who wants to ask something? I mean, after looking at that, the obvious question is, can you mark off areas where people live which are not quite so exposed? How does one phrase it?
And they fish. There are a lot of commercial fishing going on just downstream.
So living, working, and recreation are all interwoven. All right. We'll move to Dr. Callender, and I guess this time calling someone for doctor is correct. I apologize. I graduated from the University of California at Irvine. Actually, it's near where I grew up, with a bachelor's degree in physics, and received his MD from Louisiana State University of Medicine in New Orleans. He's board certified in internal medicine and is currently working in the area of occupational environmental toxicology. In addition to giving many speeches and presentations on the relationship between health and the environment, Dr. Callender is a member of numerous environmental health associations. And his job, I know, is not easy. I have some friends at Yale who are in this area, and every time they find something, and then something bad happens, they never know whether there's a conspiracy or a problem, so it's difficult. It might be better if you actually spoke from there. I think it's easier to use a mic.
I got interested in the area of environmental medicine. You get a basic amount of it in training programs and positions in Louisiana. But over a period of time, I began to see cases that affected people in my regular medical practice, and saw some pretty dramatic effects. And over a period of time, got more and more interested. And at this point, I get some fairly interesting cases from around the country. And one of the things that I've seen is that there are some interesting things happening in relation to women's health and in relation to the environment. One of the things that you see is that over the, I guess since the 1940s, there's been a real movement of women into various occupations that are kind of traditionally done by men. To give you an example, I have some patients that were involved, they were women that were involved in the Desert Storm war in Iraq. One particular woman who's I'm thinking of was a medical officer and had to go up into Iraq with the troops and basically was exposed to as much risk as any man that you would think of in a combat situation, and probably maybe even worse, since that person's job is providing medical care and not necessarily worrying about protection and defense. They probably even at more risk. So the women in this kind of example are exposed to all the things that you see in modern combat. There was exploding ammunition dumps that were suspected to contain chemical warfare agents. You had the oil fires. There were medications that were given to the troops to try to protect them from chemical warfare agents that made the, many cases made these individuals ill. And one thing that I thought was kind of obvious, and especially having this come from a medical person, was that no matter whether you're a large person or a small individual, male or female, everybody was pretty much given the same kinds of medications. They weren't adjusting it for body dose, body weight and such. And a lot of women I talked to that were in that combat situation had problems, and obviously it's something that you wouldn't expect to see without that migration of women into those kinds of jobs and risks. Also seeing a lot of situations where women are working in technical jobs such as aircraft engine manufacturing and refurbishing, where they're exposed to chemicals and solvents that traditionally this was a job that mostly men did. And some of the health effects that you might wonder about in women and theorize and postulate really haven't been explored that much. What are some of these exotic chemicals doing in terms of reproductive capacities and such? And basically we're seeing women migrate into these positions, and in retrospect we'll decide what has happened to their health, but really there's no studies that look forward and predict what's going to happen. Also, there's kind of more of an area of risk that come from traditional activities. What I've seen is cases where women who are homemakers, they're staying home, they're not out in the factories and they're not in combat, find themselves at risk because let's say if they're living in a neighborhood that has problems with pollution, like some of the things that Mr. Fontenot showed us. Well, the husband can be off driving a truck or in a different area of the community, or maybe not even close by, and has a totally different exposure situation than the housewife who's staying home and is having to deal with all the contaminants that might be in that neighborhood. And I've seen several situations where that was the case, where the women would be sicker simply because they were home and being exposed, whereas the men were not. And then the children often are in school and gone and have kind of in-between exposures. You often see information and discussion in the literature about conditions that seem to be related to being female. Chronic fatigue syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity, autoimmunity, various psychological disorders are frequently kind of reported to be associated with being a female, but very often these things have not been studied to the point to really understand what the difference is. I have seen some environment, like work environments, where I think the predilection of women to a complaint was simply because there was more women that were working in that particular type of job. But I've also seen a lot of situations where the men and women were both exposed, but there did seem to be a physiological difference, and basically the men would complain in a different fashion. Maybe the women would be more descriptive and vocal and about what they were feeling and what was happening, and very often the men were very sick, but just had a tendency to kind of accept the symptoms as their fate, so to speak, and the women were more likely to say something's wrong. But I've also seen situations where it does seem that there's an actual, say, difference in the predilection for particular illnesses. And in some of the communities that I've seen that had a lot of problems with pollution, there were high incidences of reports from various women that lived in the community of menstrual problems, miscarriages, difficulty with their pregnancies in general, and reports that the children that were born and raised in that particular community had high incidences, say, seizures and learning disabilities, behavioral problems, whereas their children that were born outside of that community and had not been raised there had much less problems. And I've seen that kind of situation reported many times actually, but in general you find very little research that really tries to address those kinds of issues and try to determine what the important on a national scale for those kind of complaints are. Besides spending more time at home and being exposed to, let's say, neighborhood pollution, there's also an issue with women that are home that are exposed to various products, that whether it's some kind of, whether it's a pesticide or a floor cleaner or some kind of household agent. From time to time, these things have been noticed, these kind of products have been noticed to be potentially hazardous. And if you're the one who's home all day with these products, you can develop health issues that kind of are cult. They sneak up on the person, and what you basically observe is a difference in sexes, sex complaints, but you really don't know if it's because there's something different about the way the women respond or they're exposed to more. I had a friend who was a researcher who used a particular chemical called a 4-ball ester as an agent they used to damage nerve tissue doing various studies. He was a researcher in a laboratory, and one day he came to my office and he was very upset because he had been at a conference somewhere and he noticed that this same particular chemical was an ingredient that had been put in various floor waxes to make them look, somehow it gave a chemical property to this material that gave you a nice hard, I guess, clear floor covering that lasted a long time. And he considered this material to be highly toxic. In their lab, they had to treat it with a tremendous amount of respect. And then when he realized that it was being used in a product that could be put down on the floor in their home, he was naturally very concerned and brought me some papers related to what kind of products these would be in. So that would be kind of a theoretical example of how you can be exposed to something in the home that you wouldn't realize that would actually be there. There's very often issues that come up with women about pesticides. They're home all day. Most of the day, if there's a pesticide that's applied inappropriately, they're going to be the ones that are exposed to it to the largest degree. So besides kind of differences in exposures, sometimes in history there have been certain kinds of jobs that were actually kind of, say, traditionally taken by women, and were also traditionally jobs that were industrial. There's been kind of famous cases like, Willie Fontenot was talking about the radioactive materials that are now discussed as being in oil field production. Well, some of those same components, such as radium, at one time in say the 1920s and 30s was used to make watch dials that glowed in the dark, and the paint was, the women basically did the painting. And so that was a job where a disease, occupational disease, became primarily one that affected women, but it was more just because of this tradition that had evolved that women would do this kind of artistic work and therefore became exposed to a substance that was very dangerous, as opposed to, say, that the norm of the oil field waste that we could all be exposed to. But again, there's that issue that, as Mr. Fontenot mentioned, that sometimes these radioactive materials, or in general other toxic substances, can be brought into the home by the men on their work clothes, and these clothes go in the washing machine. Their clothes can be very dirty, and they're handled by the women, so they can have exposures that you wouldn't expect without some detailed analysis. I also see cases where women are exposed to hazardous materials that really come from just their culture and the various things such as the cosmetic activities that women engage in, chemicals that are used in hair salons, on fingernails, on hairs, that can be toxic, and especially the women as they work in those facilities, hair salons, can be exposed to some materials over and over again. So here we have a job that's basically gender related, but it's more of a cultural aspect as opposed to a physiological difference. And one of the things that's interesting in the cases that I look at is kind of the perceptions of society is, and what goes on with disease, especially if it seems to have a gender difference, and also just in terms of the value of the weight that we put on an illness. I recently went to Bhopal, India, to help with a commission of doctors that were reevaluating the survivors of that disaster that occurred there in 1984. And one of the things that was told to us that was I didn't expect, and which was that in that particular culture, they were very concerned, the Indians were very concerned about the health of the female children that had lived through that experience. And that many of those women were having, now 10 years later, they were ages where they were getting married or should be. And many of the individuals in the community perceived these women as having something wrong with them since they had been exposed to these chemicals, and there was uncertainty about what the chemicals had done to them, isocyanates and possibly other chemicals. So basically, if a woman had come through that period of time and was of marriageable age in that region, they found a great deal of difficulty being accepted. And since they culturally didn't have a lot of options open to them in terms of other kinds of employment such you have in the United States, that they found themselves at a tremendous disadvantage. So we have a kind of a difference in perception of what the value of a exposure or an illness that would be that's caused a great deal of damage that goes beyond just the toxicological aspects. Very often I see women that have developed some type of illness. Very often, a very common situation that's cropping up these days is something that might be called sick building syndrome or building-related illness. And very often there's many women that are involved in that. I think to a large degree simply because of just the percentage population that's going to be women spending a lot of time in a particular building. But there does seem to be some difference in, as I said, the kind of the complaint rate between, say, males and females. But very often what you see is a situation developed where many of these women that come to me are professionals. They may be attorneys, they may be accountants, even physicians. Women that have developed some kind of real debilitating set of symptoms and problems after being in that type of sick building syndrome. And they find that they don't really get a lot of I guess, sympathy, or it's very difficult to get help. If that individual cannot pursue their career as a professional, there really is a lot of limitations that they realize. You know, they've had to fight hard to get recognition, to get the professional standing and such, and then they find that they're sick, and it's difficult to go out and just, at say middle age, and retool and come up with a new type of profession. One of the things that often happens out of that is that the women are thought of as simply being neurotic, and that there's kind of a tendency to put a label on if a female has more than a certain number of complaints, especially if they're difficult to analyze and to deal with. There's a tendency to slap a label on them as that they're a neurotic female, that they've got this, basically a predilection to this kind of behavior. And very often this flies in the face of looking at the history of that individual, that they were a very stable, hardworking professional that had gone through college professional training and had excellent credentials, and get to be, say, middle-aged, and then find themselves exposed to some kind of hazardous material, and then develop a whole complex of symptoms. and very often are just written off as being neurotic, whereas from the medical literature and the standard way of looking at these kinds of issues, a person doesn't just get to be that middle-aged and have accomplished all those things, and then just simply develop a psychiatric, especially a personality-related psychiatric condition. If a person is going to have some kinds of behavioral problems, personality aberrations, it should really be something that's been from a very early age. But far too often I see situations where I think if the man comes down with similar complaints, he's labeled as just being a troublemaker, and then the women are basically labeled as being kind of hysterical females, irregardless of all the facts of the case. And that's one of the things that I get calls almost constantly from around the United States of women that have been exposed in some kind of a setting, very often working in a building of some type that had some kind of sick building type symptoms, and then finding a great deal of difficulty getting kind of sympathy from the medical profession. And there are certain issues that make those kinds of diagnoses difficult when you really want to look at environmental illness, occupational type illnesses. It does take a great deal of time. It takes a lot of talking to the patient, understanding their background and where they came from, getting to know them. Some of the patients that I had originally that really focused my interest in this area were patients that I had known for a very long time. And when they came down with multiple symptoms of all